Consider a scenario where a woman named Talia plants a timed bomb on a cargo plane to destroy a shipment of insured antiques. Mid-flight, the plane explodes, killing the crew. The physical act of destruction is complete. Talia is charged with murder, but she presents a specific legal defense. She claims she had no desire to kill the crew. Her goal was financial, insurance fraud, and she hoped the crew would somehow survive. To establish criminal liability, the prosecution must prove two distinct elements. The first is Actus Reus, the guilty physical act. The second is Mens Rea, the guilty state of mind. A conviction requires these two pieces to lock together. Talia's financial goal is her motive, her underlying reason for acting. But criminal law draws a strict boundary between motive and intention. The court evaluates what a person aimed to do, not why they did it. A common error in legal analysis is assuming that a secondary motive negates legal intent. Even if a defendant acts out of compassion, such as in a mercy killing, the mental element of murder is still satisfied if they intended to cause death. The law separates the internal reason from the external aim. This structure guarantees that defendants cannot use their personal justifications, like a desperate need for insurance money, to shield themselves from the legal consequences of their actions. Mens rea is a descending hierarchy of mental states. It scales downward from intention, which carries the highest culpability, through recklessness and negligence, stopping finally at strict liability. At the top of this spectrum sits direct intention. The legal test here asks a single question: was the prohibited consequence the defendant's specific aim or purpose? Applying this standard to Talia, she lacks direct intention for murder. The death of the crew was an unwanted side effect, not her primary goal. If an outcome is a defendant's true aim, the law ignores how unlikely they are to succeed. A terrible shot firing a gun from a long distance possesses direct intention if their explicit goal is to hit the target. Because Talia's aim was property damage, direct intention fails. To secure a murder conviction, the prosecution must move down the hierarchy and rely on secondary legal mechanisms to prove she possessed the required state of mind. This legal scenario creates a specific problem. How does a court prove intent for murder when the legal outcome was a byproduct of what the defendant set out to achieve? The courts addressed this through the concept of indirect or oblique intention. It is a mechanism designed to catch defendants whose actions cause massive, obvious harm while they are focused on a different goal. The Woollin case established a strict two-stage test for oblique intention. First, the objective prong. Was the prohibited consequence a virtually certain result of the act? Second, the subjective prong. Did the defendant appreciate this was a virtual certainty? For Talia, planting a timed bomb on an airborne plane makes the death of the crew an objective virtual certainty. Given the violent nature of the explosion, a jury would easily conclude she subjectively foresaw that demise. Both prongs of the Woollin test are satisfied. Defining this threshold took decades of judicial debate. In earlier cases like Hancock and Shankland, where striking minors dropped a concrete block onto a taxi, the court struggled with ambiguous phrasing. Instructing juries to consider natural and probable consequences led to inconsistent convictions. Parliament eventually provided statutory guidance with Section 8 of the Criminal Justice Act 1967. This section directs how juries should evaluate evidence to ascertain a defendant's subjective foresight. Section 8 of the Act sets a strict boundary. A jury is not bound to infer intent just because a result was highly probable. What a reasonable person would foresee is strictly evidence, an indicator a jury can use to decide what the actual defendant anticipated. The high virtual certainty threshold limits oblique intention to a narrow set of cases. It ensures that severe recklessness or foreseeable accidents are not upgraded to the specific intent required for murder. If an action falls short of virtual certainty, we step down the culpability spectrum. Take a scenario where a man named Ryan punches another man once during an argument. The victim falls, hits his head on a table, and fractures his skull. Proving Ryan intended to cause severe harm from a single punch is highly unlikely. Instead, the prosecution will aim to prove recklessness. In criminal law, recklessness is the conscious taking of an unjustified risk. The definitive test for this mental state was codified by the House of Lords in the landmark case of RVG. The RVG test requires two elements. First, a subjective standard. Did the specific defendant personally foresee a risk of the consequence occurring? Second, an objective standard. Having foreseen that risk, was it socially unjustified to take it based on reasonable standards? This subjective requirement corrected a heavily criticized prior ruling known as the Caldwell test. Caldwell utilized an objective standard, punishing defendants who failed to perceive risks that would have been obvious to a reasonable person. For exam purposes, note that Caldwell is no longer good law for criminal damage. You must apply Cunningham or RVG recklessness, where the defendant's actual, subjective awareness of the risk is required. Returning to subjective recklessness was a moral necessity. Convicting someone of a serious crime demands proof of a culpable state of mind. It is unjust to brand a defendant as reckless based entirely on what someone else would have anticipated. At the very bottom of the culpability spectrum lies strict liability. For these offenses, the requirement for a guilty mind is stripped away entirely. A defendant can be convicted without proof of intention, recklessness, or negligence. Because this bypasses standard rules of fault, the courts approach these crimes cautiously. As established in Sweet v. Parsley, there is a strong constitutional presumption that Parliament intends for all crimes to require mens rea. To rebut this presumption, courts examine the statutory definition and the social context of the law, looking for explicit wording from Parliament and checking whether the crime regulates a dangerous activity. Section 5 of the Road Traffic Act 1988 is a classic example. If a person drives a vehicle with an alcohol level above the prescribed limit, they are guilty. The prosecution does not need to prove the driver knew they were over the limit. The physical act alone completes the offense. Strict liability is justified by public policy. In areas involving public safety, regarding basic food standards and environmental protection, removing the mens rea requirement forces individuals and corporations to maintain extreme vigilance. It prioritizes the physical safety of the public over the mental blameworthiness of the offender. Even when a defendant possesses the exact required mens rea, the execution can complicate liability. Consider an attacker who plans to shoot one specific person, but their aim is poor and the bullet strikes and kills a bystander instead. The law resolves this using the doctrine of transferred malice. Under the Latimer precedent, the intent directed at the original target is legally shifted to the actual victim. The specific intent to murder combines with the physical act of killing the bystander. There is a strict boundary to this doctrine, established in the Pembliton Rule. Malice cannot transfer between fundamentally different types of offenses. If a defendant throws a stone intending to assault a person but breaks a window instead, the intent for physical assault cannot be transferred to fulfill the mens rea for criminal damage. Relying on transferred malice is often unnecessary if the offense includes recklessness. If the defendant threw the stone and simply foresaw the risk of hitting the window, the subjective test for recklessness handles the liability without needing to transfer intent. Transferred malice acts as a crucial legal bridge. It ensures that an offender who acts with criminal intent and causes prohibited harm cannot use their own bad aim or mistaken identity as a valid legal defense. The bedrock rule of criminal liability states that the actus reus and the mens rea must coincide in time. They must exist at the exact same moment. This temporal rule creates a paradox when events stretch out. Imagine an attacker hits a victim over the head with intent to kill. The victim survives the blow, but the attacker, believing they are dead, throws the body over a cliff to hide it. The victim then dies from exposure. The intent to kill existed during the non-fatal blow, and the fatal act occurred when there was only an intent to dispose of a corpse. To solve this paradox, the courts apply the single transaction principle. Derived from Thabo-Meli and affirmed in Brun, this tool addresses complex sequences of events. The court treats the entire series of actions, from the initial strike to the disposal of the body, as one continuous chain. By legally collapsing these separate events into a single transaction, the initial guilty mind is attached to the eventual fatal act. A parallel solution exists for the reverse scenario, known as the continuing act principle. In the Fagan case, a driver accidentally parked on a police officer's foot. There was no guilty mind initially present, but when the driver realized what had happened and refused to move, the court classified the resting car as a continuing act. The crime occurred the exact moment the driver formed the mens rea to leave the car there. When analyzing criminal liability, the sequence is highly structured. First, establish the physical act. Second, isolate the specific mental state required on the spectrum. Third, apply the subjective or objective tests. Finally, verify that the act and the mind lock together in time. Criminal law demands a rigorous intersection of action and intent. When strict temporal boundaries threaten to produce absurd acquittals, the courts stretch the definition of an act and transfer malice to ensure that culpable behavior is accurately penalized.